Rule number one of week 2 in fantasy football: do not overreact. My name is Steven Andrus, and you're watching the Radio.com Sports Fantasy Football Show. Let's get it. Ryan Fitzpatrick and Isiah Crowell were both top 5 at their position after week 1 a year ago. What'd they do the rest of the season? Not much. In week 1, we're looking for waiver wire pickups who are going to have good performances throughout this season, not just guys who are one-week wonders. So in pick 'em up for week number 2, my top guy is a guy who had 0 yards in week 1. It's Chiefs rookie wideout Mecole Hardman, and obviously this is because Tyreek Hill is out injured with a shoulder injury, but you want to take chances on this Kansas City Chiefs offense. And the usage for Hardman after Tyreek Hill went out was very promising. He played 53 of 59 snaps week 1 against Jacksonville, including 22 in the slot. That is the kind of usage you're looking for from a waiver wire pickup. And moving forward the next couple of weeks, as long as Tyreek Hill is out, Mecole Hardman is a high upside flex option. Our next pickup is wide receiver John Brown from the Buffalo Bills. Double-digit targets in week 1 against the Jets, and what did he do with those 10 targets? He exploded. 7 receptions, 123 yards, and a go-ahead touchdown against New York, despite that game being a very low-scoring 17-16 final. I was telling people going into the season, John Brown should be on all rosters. I think he's going to be close to that now after this waiver wire pickup in week number 2. My third pickup is another receiver, a rookie. It's Marquise Hollywood Brown of the Baltimore Ravens. Now, a lot of people, I think, in the fantasy industry are going to tell you you shouldn't pick this guy up because he played fewer than 20 snaps in week number 1. To me, because he's a rookie and because he had 4 receptions for 147 yards and 2 touchdowns on only 5 targets playing less than 20 snaps, that's promising to me. That means this is a rookie whose role is going to grow as the season goes on. He was a first-round pick in the NFL draft. He's going to see more and more playing time as his rookie season advances. So just manage your expectations with him. He's not going to play the Dolphins every single week. He's not going to pop for 147 yards and 2 scores, but he's still a solid stash option moving forward that should be on your bench. And let's see what he turns into as the fantasy season develops. Lastly, another tight end to pick up and another rookie. TJ Hockenson of the Detroit Lions, the rookie out of Iowa, did very well in his debut against the Arizona Cardinals. 9 targets, and what I liked while watching that game is that a lot of those targets were design plays for Hockenson, for Matthew Stafford to get him the ball. He turned it into 6 receptions, 131 yards, and 1 touchdown. That is hard to find among the tight end position, and if you can find a guy who could turn into a top 10 option off the waiver wire at tight end, that is gold for your fantasy team. Go out and get Hockenson. Let's move on to the stream team. These are quarterbacks, tight ends, and defenses you can pick up and start in week number 2 among those owned in fewer than 50% of leagues. And at the quarterback position, the first one I'm going to mention had just 10 pass attempts in week number 1, but his ceiling is much higher in week 2. Vikings quarterback Kirk Cousins goes to Green Bay to take on the Packers in week number 2. Against Green Bay a season ago, he combined for 767 yards and 7 touchdowns in 2 games against the Packers. Green Bay allowed almost 18 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks last year. And in fantasy, it's important to avoid recency bias. Yes, the Green Bay defense was awesome, but it was against Mitch Trubisky in week number 1. And yes, Cousins only had 10 pass attempts in week number 1. But that's not going to happen every single week. Yes, the Vikings want to be run first, but Cousins is going to have to throw it a lot more to keep up with Aaron Rodgers. The next streaming option among quarterbacks is Josh Allen of the Buffalo Bills. I loved that he had 10 rushing attempts in week number 1. Didn't do much with it, less than 40 yards rushing, but that is the kind of floor that gives you solid success at the quarterback position in fantasy football. And in week number 2, he goes on to take the Giants, who just gave up more than 400 yards and 4 touchdowns to Dak Prescott. My last streaming option is a backup quarterback who's now starting for Jacksonville with Nick Foles injured. It's Gardner Minshew. Didn't think I'd be mentioning his name in week 2 this season, but stash the stash. Maybe even start the stash in week number 2. Amazing facial hair, amazing NFL debut against the Kansas City Chiefs for Minshew off the bench. 22 of 25 for 275 yards, 2 touchdowns, and a pick. And in week number 2, he gets to take on the Houston Texans. Let's move on to streaming tight ends, and there's really only one that I have a lot of confidence in among those owned in fewer than 50% of leagues. It's Jimmy Graham from the Green Bay Packers. He gets to take on the Vikings. In week 1, he had 6 targets, 3 receptions, 30 yards, and a touchdown. He did have a 95-yard game against the Vikings a year ago. Streaming defenses for week 2, the Dallas Cowboys are owned in fewer than 50% of leagues, and they have a great matchup week 2 against the Washington Redskins on the road. In week 1 against the Giants, 17 points allowed, 2 fumble recoveries. They added a sack as well. With that defensive front in Dallas, they should feast on Washington's offensive line without Trent Williams. And my second streaming option is the Kansas City Chiefs. Yes, this is typically not a good real-world defense, but can still give you great opportunities in fantasy. They're going to be playing with a lead. Teams are going to have to play from behind. And the Oakland Raiders are the matchup. The Chiefs had 7 turnovers and 6 sacks, including an interception return for a touchdown in their 2 games against the Raiders a year ago. Stealthy starts now. And the first is a guy who did not do well in week 1, but the other running back in his backfield is now injured, which means he has a great matchup and now volume in week 2. Matt Breida of the San Francisco 49ers. Tevin Coleman should be out with an ankle injury. He gets to take on the Cincinnati Bengals, who allowed the 3rd most points to running backs a year ago. And they allowed 2 touchdowns to Chris Carson in week number 1. So I think Breida's a solid flex option in week number 2. 2 receivers I like as well. Let's start with Curtis Samuel of the Carolina Panthers. It's a Thursday night game against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. A huge preseason darling among the fantasy industry as a breakout candidate. A slow start, just 3 receptions for 32 yards in week 1. But Tampa Bay allowed the 4th most fantasy points to wide receivers a year ago. Samuel, double-digit PPR points in both of his games against the Bucs last year. Hopefully, if you're watching this after Thursday's game, Samuel proved me right, and we can all celebrate. Lastly, Jarvis Landry of the Cleveland Browns. Again, not a huge stealthy start, but he's been very inconsistent since Freddie Kitchens took over as head coach of the Cleveland Browns. You saw how consistent the whole team was in week 1, but I think if you have Jarvis Landry and you're not confident starting him, I think you can be in week number 2 specifically. He's taking on the New York Jets. He had just 4 receptions for 67 yards in week 1, did Landry, but he faces Brian Poole, the Jets slot corner, who allowed a 114.5 passer rating to opposing quarterbacks a year ago. That ranked 79th among all cornerbacks in 2018. Jarvis Landry has a pristine matchup for week number 2. That'll do it for this week's episode of the Radio.com Sports Fantasy Football Show. My name is Steven Andress. We'll see you right back here next week for week number 3. Good luck in week number 2.